Hey guys, tonight we begin with the strange, often funny, and occasionally absurd rules of medieval castles. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk into the great hall of a medieval castle thinking you've made it. Warm fire, long wooden tables, food that looks vaguely edible. People dressed like they've been preparing for this moment since birth. For a brief second you relax and think, this isn't so bad. That's your first mistake. Because the first thing you need to understand is this. You are not here to enjoy yourself. You are here to survive a very complicated social system disguised as dinner. And the fastest way to fail that system is to sit down. Now, in your world, chairs are simple. You see one, you sit on it. Maybe you even pick strategically, closer to the fire, better lighting, fewer people judging you. In a medieval castle, that exact same decision turns into a high-stakes gamble with your dignity and possibly your safety. Because seating is not random. It's a perfectly organized hierarchy that everyone understands. Except you, who just walked in thinking this was a casual event. At the far end of the hall sits the Lord, elevated, centered, the human equivalent of a do not touch sign. Next to him his family, then high nobles, then less important nobles, then knights, then guests, then servants, and then there's you, somewhere between background character and why is he here? But you don't know that. So you walk in, scan the room, and your brain, trained by modern logic, goes, that seat looks available. I will take it, which is exactly what you do. And immediately, everything changes. It's subtle at first. A pause, a glance. Someone mid-bite just stops chewing. Conversations don't end. They just lose energy. Like the room itself is quietly processing your decision. Because you didn't just sit. You made a statement. A very bold, very incorrect statement. You've just placed yourself above someone who outranks you, which, in medieval terms, is not just rude, it's borderline offensive, possibly suspicious, and definitely memorable. And worst of all, you did it publicly. Now the person you just outranked has a problem. If they ignore you, they lose status. If they correct you, they regain it. And people with power love regaining things. So best case scenario, a servant rushes over and gently relocates you before this becomes a story people tell later. Worst case, you've just embarrassed someone who owns both land and men with swords, which is not a great combination for your long-term plans. And here's the part that really hurts. No one thinks you made a mistake. They think you meant it. That you walked in, saw the hierarchy and thought, yes, I belong up there. Which is an incredible level of confidence for someone who, 5 minutes ago, didn't even know where the door was. So you stand up, quickly, awkwardly, possibly escorted, realizing that in this world, chairs are not furniture. They are power, and you just accidentally tried to steal some. So you've survived the seating situation. Barely. You've been relocated to a safer, less controversial part of the table, somewhere between socially acceptable and completely forgettable, which at this point feels like a victory. Naturally, this gives you confidence, which is your next mistake. Because now you think, okay, just don't sit wrong again, and everything will be fine. And then you open your mouth. In a medieval castle, speaking is not something you just do. It's something you are allowed to do. There's a difference. Conversation here follows the same rules as seating. Strict, invisible, and absolutely not explained to you. Nobles speak first. Important people speak more. Everyone else listens, nods, and exists quietly like background furniture that occasionally breathes. And you are not high on the speaking list. But maybe you forget. Maybe someone says something interesting. Maybe there's a pause in conversation and your brain, again using modern logic, goes, my time to contribute. So you do. You say something harmless. A comment, a joke, an observation. Something that in your world would be completely normal. And immediately, the room goes quiet. Not loud quiet, not dramatic quiet. Just that very specific, uncomfortable silence where everyone suddenly becomes extremely aware that something has gone wrong. And that something is you. Because you didn't just speak, you spoke without permission, which, in a place built entirely on hierarchy, is not seen as confidence. It's seen as overstepping. You've just inserted yourself into a conversation that wasn't yours. You've drawn attention without earning it. And worse, you've done it in front of people who measure status very carefully. Now everyone is looking at you, not with curiosity, with evaluation. Who are you? Why are you speaking? Who allowed this? And most importantly, should this be corrected? Because correction in this world is not always verbal. Best case scenario, someone higher ranked politely ignores you, which is actually a signal for you to stop existing conversationally. Slightly worse case, you get a sharp look or a cold response that quietly reminds you of your place. Worst case, you've just interrupted someone important, which means you're no longer just out of place. You're disrespectful, and disrespect in a medieval castle tends to escalate quickly. So you learn very quickly. You don't fill silences. You don't add thoughts. You don't join in. You wait. You exist. You speak only when spoken to. Because in this world, silence isn't awkward. It's safe. And right now, safe is exactly what you need. At this point, you've learned two important lessons. Don't sit where you want. Don't speak when you want. So naturally, you assume the safest strategy is simple. Just exist quietly. Don't move too much. Don't draw attention. Maybe eat something slowly and mind your business. And honestly, that's not a bad plan. Until your hand does something completely normal. It reaches, maybe for a cup, maybe for a piece of bread, maybe for something on the table that looks like it has absolutely no consequences attached to it. And that's when you realize you've made another mistake. Because in a medieval castle, nothing is just there. Everything belongs to someone. That goblet, owned. That plate, owned. That knife, definitely owned. And possibly very meaningful to the person who owns it. And that piece of bread you just casually grabbed, also not yours. Which means what you just did wasn't taking food. It was taking something that belonged to someone else. And in this world, ownership is not flexible. It's absolute. Objects are not just objects. They represent status, wealth, and identity. They are extensions of the person who owns them. So when you touch them without permission, you're not just being careless. You're crossing a line, and like everything else in this castle, people notice. Not dramatically. No one jumps up and points at you. It's worse than that. It's subtle. A glance, a pause, someone slightly turning their head. The person sitting near you becoming very aware of your hand and what it's doing. Because now there's a question in the air. Did you mean to do that? And if you did, why? Because again, no one assumes ignorance. They assume intent. Maybe you're disrespectful. Maybe you're testing boundaries. Maybe you're someone who doesn't understand their place. None of those are good options. Best case scenario, someone quietly corrects you. Maybe a servant replaces the item. Maybe you're gently told not to touch what isn't yours. Worst case, you've just taken something belonging to someone with power, pride, and absolutely no interest in explaining things to you. Which means your small, harmless action has just turned into something much bigger. A sign of disrespect. And in a castle, disrespect is rarely ignored. So you pull your hand back. Slowly, carefully. Like someone who has just realized that even the most basic movements require strategy. Because here, nothing is casual. Not sitting. Not speaking. Not even reaching for food. And if you're going to survive, your hands need to learn discipline too. By now you've accepted something important. You are not here to enjoy the meal. You are here to survive it. Because somehow, despite your best efforts, even eating, yes, eating has rules. Not simple rules. Not don't chew loudly rules. No. These are layered, silent, highly judgmental rules that everyone follows. Except you, who is currently holding a piece of bread like it might explode. Because here's the problem. You don't know when to start. In a medieval castle, you don't just eat when food appears. You wait. For the Lord, for the signal. For that invisible moment when everyone collectively agrees, now we may consume. If you start too early, you're impatient. If you hesitate too long, you look confused. If you stare at the food like you're solving a puzzle, you look suspicious. There is no correct timing, only less dangerous timing. And then comes the technique. You don't grab. You don't reach across. You don't take the best portion unless you're important enough to do so. Which, let's be honest, you are not. You take what is near you, carefully, modestly. like someone who fully understands that their continued existence depends on not being noticed. And then there's the hand. Yes, the hand. Use the wrong one, and suddenly you've revealed yourself as uncultured. Medieval dining had expectations, often involving which hand you used for eating, and which hand you absolutely did not, unless you wanted to broadcast information about your hygiene choices. So now you're thinking about your hands, which is not something you expected to do this much today. Then there's quantity. Eat too much? Greedy. Eat too little? Suspicious. Eat too fast? Uncivilized. Eat too slow? Strange. At this point, eating feels less like nourishment and more like a performance review. And everyone is watching. Not obviously, but enough. Because in a castle, how you eat says something about who you are. Your discipline, your upbringing, your respect for order. And if what it says is wrong, people notice. And once again, the consequences aren't immediate. They're worse. They're remembered. So you choose slowly, carefully, trying to look like someone who absolutely knows what they're doing, even though, internally, you're just hoping to make it through the meal without accidentally offending someone over a piece of bread. Because here, even dinner is dangerous. By now, you've mastered the basics of survival. You sit where you're told. You speak when necessary. You touch nothing. You eat like your life depends on it. So naturally, you assume the hardest part is over. It isn't. Because now, you have to deal with your eyes, which unfortunately you cannot turn off. In a medieval castle, looking is not neutral. Looking is communication. And like everything else here, there are rules, very specific rules, that no one explains to you. So you do what feels normal. You look around, at the hall, the decorations, the people, the lord sitting at the high table, surrounded by wealth, power, and the kind of confidence that suggests he hasn't worried about seating arrangements in years. And that's when the problem begins, because you look a little too long, not intentionally, just enough. And suddenly, what was harmless curiosity becomes something else, attention. And attention in this setting is dangerous, because if you look too little, you seem nervous, weak, uncertain, like someone who doesn't belong. But if you look too much, especially at someone important, you're no longer just observing, you're staring. And staring, depending on who you're looking at, can be interpreted as many things. Interest, challenge, disrespect, none of which you can afford. So now you're stuck in a very uncomfortable balancing act. Look just enough to appear aware, but not enough to be noticed, which is of course impossible, because the moment you start thinking about where to look, you immediately start looking wrong. You glance at a noble, too long. You quickly look away, too fast. Now you seem suspicious. You try to focus on your plate, but now you look disconnected. You look up again. Someone catches your eye, and now you're locked in the worst possible situation. Eye contact. Because eye contact, especially with someone above your rank, is not casual. It's loaded. Hold it too long, and it feels like a challenge. Break it too quickly, and you seem afraid. And both of those send signals you don't want to send. So you do what anyone in your position would do. You pretend to be very interested in something completely harmless. The table, the food, that one piece of bread you've been slowly eating for the past 10 minutes. Anything that doesn't involve accidentally challenging someone who could ruin your day without standing up. Because in this world, even your eyes need discipline. And the difference between a glance and a problem is about half a second. At this point, you're starting to feel experienced. You've survived sitting, speaking, eating, even looking, which somehow required more strategy than you expected from your own eyes. So naturally you assume movement will be simple. You stand up, you leave the table, you walk away. Easy. Except it isn't. Because in a medieval castle, how you leave a space matters just as much as how you enter it. And the worst thing you can do? Turn your back. Now, in your world, turning your back is normal. You finish a conversation, you turn, you go. No one thinks twice about it. In a castle, turning your back, especially on someone of higher rank, is not just casual movement. It's a statement, and not a good one. Because turning your back can be interpreted as dismissal, as if you've decided the person in front of you is no longer worth your attention. And if that person happens to be powerful, you've just made a very bold, very unwise decision. So now, instead of walking away like a normal human being, you have to leave carefully. You step back slightly. You lower your gaze, not too much, not too little. You angle your body just enough to show respect, but not enough to look like you're trying too hard. And then you begin the slow, awkward process of exiting without fully turning your back, which, if you're imagining it, looks exactly as uncomfortable as it feels. Because it is, you're essentially trying to walk away while still acknowledging someone behind you, which goes against everything your body naturally wants to do. And of course, you're doing all of this while being watched, because people notice how you leave, just like they noticed how you sat, how you spoke, how you ate. Everything here is observed, evaluated, remembered. So if you turn too quickly, disrespectful. If you hesitate too long, awkward. If you stumble while trying to maintain this strange half-facing posture, unforgettable. And not in a good way. So you move slowly, deliberately, like someone who understands that even walking away has consequences. Because in a medieval castle, respect isn't just shown in words. It's shown in movement, in posture, in the direction your body faces at any given moment. And one wrong turn, literally, can turn you from invisible into a problem. At this point, you're doing surprisingly well. You've mastered sitting, speaking, eating, looking, and even the deeply unnatural art of leaving a room without accidentally offending someone. So naturally, you assume personal hygiene is the one thing you don't have to worry about. After all, how dangerous can being clean possibly be? Very. Because in a medieval castle, even how you smell sends a message. And like everything else here, it's the wrong message that gets you into trouble. Now let's start with the obvious. If you're too dirty, that's a problem. Medieval life was not exactly known for modern hygiene standards. But that doesn't mean people were comfortable with someone who smelled like they had been living under a horse for a week. Too dirty and you're seen as careless, low status, or simply unpleasant. And unpleasant people tend to be avoided, which, in a place where connections matter, is not great. But here's where it gets complicated. If you're too clean, that's also a problem. Because excessive cleanliness can make people suspicious. Why do you smell better than everyone else? Who are you trying to impress? What are you hiding? Yes, somehow being clean can make you look suspicious. Because strong scents, perfumes, oils, anything noticeable, are often associated with wealth, influence, or intentions. And if you're not in a position to justify that level of refinement, people start asking questions, quietly, which, as you've probably realized by now, is the worst kind of questioning. So you're stuck in a very uncomfortable middle ground. Not too dirty, not too clean, just acceptable. Which sounds simple until you realize there is no clear definition of acceptable. It depends on who's around you. It depends on the setting. It depends on how much attention you're already attracting, which, ideally, is none. So now you're thinking about things you never thought would matter. How you smell, how your clothes look, whether you appear too polished or not polished enough. And of course, you're trying to balance all of this without drawing attention to the fact that you're thinking about it. Because the moment it looks like you're trying too hard, you've already failed. So you settle for something safe, something neutral, something forgettable. Because in a castle, standing out, even for something as harmless as being clean, is still standing out. And standing out is never as safe as it sounds. By now, you've noticed a pattern. Everything in this castle has a position. Where you sit, when you speak, how you move, even how long you look at someone. It all comes back to one thing, your place. And the uncomfortable truth is, your place is not very high. Now in your world, knowing your place sounds outdated, optional, maybe even something you can challenge. In a medieval castle, it is not optional. It is the foundation of everything. Hierarchy is not just respected, it is enforced, quietly when possible, publicly when necessary. And if you forget your place, someone will remind you. Not gently, because reminders here are not meant to educate. They are meant to correct, and correction, in this environment, is often designed to be remembered. So what does forgetting your place actually look like? It's subtle. You stand a little too close to someone important. You speak slightly too confidently. You move through a space that isn't meant for you. Maybe a corridor, a doorway, a part of the hall reserved for people with titles you definitely don't have. Individually, these seem like small things. Together, they create a pattern, and people notice patterns, especially when those patterns suggest that you don't understand the structure of the world you're in. Because in a castle, Hierarchy is not just about power. It's about order, and order must be maintained. So when you step outside of your assigned role, even slightly, you're not just being awkward. You're disrupting something. And disruptions get corrected. Maybe it's a sharp word from a steward. Maybe it's a public adjustment, being told where to stand, where to go, where you should have been all along. Or maybe it's something more subtle, a look, a tone, a shift in how people treat you. Less tolerance, less patience, more distance. Because once you've shown that you don't know your place, people stop trusting you to stay in it. And trust in a place like this is everything. So you adjust quickly. You observe more, move less, speak even less than before. You become careful in ways you didn't know were possible. Because now you understand something important. Your place is not something you choose. It's something you are given. And if you don't respect it, the castle will remind you exactly where you belong. By now you've learned to stay quiet. Not completely silent, just strategically invisible. You speak when spoken to. You move carefully. You avoid attention like it's contagious. So naturally you assume you're safe. As long as you don't do anything obvious, and then someone important starts talking. Maybe it's the Lord. Maybe it's a noble. Maybe it's someone with just enough authority that everyone else suddenly becomes very interested in whatever they're saying, even if what they're saying makes absolutely no sense. And here's the rule. When power speaks, you don't. You listen. You agree. You exist quietly in the background while pretending that everything being said is both insightful and completely correct. Because interrupting someone powerful is not seen as engagement. It's seen as a challenge. And challenges in this environment are not handled through calm discussion. They are handled through correction. Now, maybe you forget. Maybe there's a pause, a slight gap in conversation, and your brain, still operating under modern logic, decides this is your moment. You lean forward. You say something. Maybe it's helpful. Maybe it's logical. Maybe it's even correct. And immediately, you feel it. Not a reaction. A shift. The person speaking stops. Slowly. Everyone else goes quiet. Not because they're interested in what you said, but because they're waiting to see what happens next. Because you didn't just speak, you interrupted. And not just anyone. Power. Which means you've just done something far more serious than making a social mistake. You've disrupted hierarchy. Now the person you interrupted has a decision to make. Ignore you, and risk looking weak, or respond, and restore their authority. And guess which option people with power usually choose. Best case scenario, you get a cold glance, a short, sharp reply that reminds you very clearly that your input was not required. Slightly worse, you're corrected publicly. Your place is reinforced in front of everyone, just in case there was any confusion. Worst case, you've embarrassed someone important, and embarrassment, especially in a room full of witnesses, has a way of turning into something much more serious. So you learn, you don't jump in, you don't add to the conversation, you wait until you are invited, which may or may not ever happen, because in a medieval castle, speaking is not about having something to say, it's about being someone who is allowed to say it. And right now, that someone is not you. At this point, you've stopped trying to understand the rules. You've accepted them. You sit carefully. You speak rarely. You move like you're being evaluated, because you are. So naturally, you assume your face is safe. It isn't. Because in a medieval castle, even your reactions are being watched. Not just what you do. Not just what you say, but how you respond to everything. A joke, a comment, a disagreement, a story that is either incredibly boring or deeply uncomfortable. Your face becomes part of the performance. And unfortunately, your face has opinions. Now in your world, reactions are normal. You laugh when something is funny. You frown when something is strange. You raise an eyebrow when something doesn't make sense. In a castle, those same reactions become signals. Laugh too loudly and you look disrespectful. Laugh too little and you look cold. Don't laugh at all when someone important makes a joke. And now you've created a problem. Because humour in this setting is not about comedy. It's about alignment. If someone powerful laughs, you laugh. Maybe not too much. Maybe not too little. Just enough to show that you understood and approved. Even if the joke made absolutely no sense. Especially then. Then there's surprise. Show too much of it and you seem unstable. Show too little and you seem uninterested. Either way, someone is quietly deciding what kind of person you are. And again, They are not generous in their interpretations. Anger? Not allowed. Fear? Not helpful. Confusion? Dangerous. Because the moment your reaction doesn't match what's expected, people notice. And they start asking silent questions. Why did you react like that? What are you thinking? Are you disagreeing? And disagreement, especially unspoken disagreement, has a way of becoming very visible very quickly. So now you're managing something you never expected to manage. Your face. You soften your expressions. You control your reactions. You learn to respond in ways that are acceptable, neutral, safe. You become someone who reacts just enough to blend in, but never enough to stand out, which is exhausting. Because now, not only are you thinking about where to sit, when to speak, and how to move, you're thinking about your eyebrows, your mouth, the exact timing of a nod. All of it carefully controlled, because in this world, even a smile can be misinterpreted, and a single wrong expression can say more than 1,000 words, none of which you want to explain. By now, you've learned to stay quiet. You've learned to move carefully, react minimally, and exist in that very narrow space where you're present, but not noticeable. So naturally, your brain does what brains do. It gets curious, because none of this makes sense. Why is everyone so careful? Why are certain doors closed? Why does that one corridor seem important? Why does everyone suddenly go silent when a specific name is mentioned? And before you can stop yourself, you ask. Just a simple question, harmless in your mind, logical, maybe even polite. Something like, what's behind that door? Or, why is everyone avoiding that area? Or the classic, what did he mean by that? And instantly, you feel it. That same shift you felt before, the subtle pause, the change in tone, the quiet realization that you've stepped somewhere you shouldn't. Because in a medieval castle, questions are not neutral. They are revealing. Every question you ask tells people something about you, what you notice, what you're interested in, what you don't understand, and more importantly, what you're not supposed to know. Because castles are not just homes. They are centers of power, politics, secrets, and alliances that are constantly shifting. Information is controlled carefully, and not everyone is meant to have access to it, especially not you. So when you ask the wrong question, people don't just hear curiosity, they hear risk. Why are you asking that? Who told you anything? What are you trying to figure out? And suddenly, your harmless question becomes something much bigger. Suspicion. Best case scenario, you get a vague answer. Something polite but empty, designed to give you nothing while making it seem like you've been answered. Slightly worse, the question is ignored entirely, which in this world is a clear signal to stop. Worst case, you've drawn attention to yourself in the worst possible way, not as someone important, but as someone who doesn't know where the boundaries are. And people who don't understand boundaries tend to become problems. So you adjust, you stop asking, you accept that there are things you're not meant to know, doors you're not meant to open, conversations you're not meant to understand. Because in this place, knowledge is not shared freely, it's controlled. And the safest thing you can do is not look for answers at all. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can be is curious. By now, you've learned something important. The danger isn't always in what you do. Sometimes it's where you are. Because castles are not just big buildings. They are controlled spaces. Every hallway, every room, every staircase has a purpose. And more importantly, a level of access. Some places are public. Some are restricted. Some are so clearly not meant for you that just standing nearby feels like a mistake. And somehow, you end up in one of those places. Maybe you took a wrong turn. Maybe you were trying to avoid attention. Maybe you were just curious. Again, not your best habit. But now you're alone, in a corridor that's too quiet, too empty. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels watched. And that's when you realize the real problem. You're not supposed to be here. Now, being somewhere you shouldn't be is already bad. But being there alone? That's worse. Because now there are no witnesses. No context. No one to confirm that you simply got lost. So if someone finds you, and someone will, you don't look confused. You look suspicious. And suspicion, in a medieval castle, escalates quickly. Because people don't start with benefit of the doubt. They start with assumptions. What are you doing here? Who sent you? What were you looking for? And suddenly, your harmless mistake becomes something much more serious. Espionage. Intrusion, disrespect. All from standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the worst part? You don't get to explain immediately, because explanations come after judgment. First you're observed, then evaluated, then addressed. And how that happens depends entirely on who finds you. A servant might quietly guide you away. A guard might question you. Someone important? They might not ask questions at all, because from their perspective the situation is already clear. You're where you shouldn't be, and that's enough. So you move carefully. You retrace your steps. You try to look like someone who absolutely knows where they're going, even though you very clearly don't, because confidence, even fake confidence, is safer than hesitation. And hesitation makes you look lost, and looking lost is what got you here in the first place. So you return to safer ground, back to the hall, back to the noise, back to the places where your presence is at least somewhat expected, because now you understand something new. In a castle, survival isn't just about behavior, it's about location, and being in the wrong place, even for a moment, can turn you into a problem. By now, you've figured out how to survive the visible rules. You sit carefully, you speak rarely, you move like every step is being judged, which it is. So naturally, you assume the real danger is over. It isn't, because everything you've dealt with so far has been surface level. Behavior, etiquette, position. Now you're entering something much more serious. Expectation. Because in a medieval castle, loyalty is not something you choose. It's something you are expected to demonstrate, constantly, and not quietly. You don't just be loyal. You look loyal. You sound loyal. You react like someone whose entire existence depends on supporting the person in charge, which, to be fair, it does. Now, in your world, loyalty can be complicated. You can agree with some things, disagree with others, keep your opinions private. In a castle, that kind of nuance doesn't exist. There is no partial loyalty. There is only clear alignment, or doubt, and doubt is dangerous. Because the moment people sense hesitation, something slightly off in how you react, how you respond, how you carry yourself, they start asking questions. Not out loud. Never out loud. But internally, is he trustworthy? Is he reliable? Is he with us? And if the answer isn't an immediate yes, you've already become a problem. So now everything you do becomes a signal. When someone praises the Lord, you agree. When someone criticizes an enemy, you agree. When something clearly questionable happens, you still agree. Not enthusiastically, not excessively, just enough. Because too much loyalty looks fake, too little looks dangerous. And somewhere in the middle is survival. But here's the difficult part. You don't always know what you're supposed to be loyal to. People, families, alliances that shift without warning. Politics you don't fully understand, which means you're constantly adjusting. Watching others, matching their tone, mirroring their reactions, trying to stay aligned with something that is always moving. And if you misread it, if you show support at the wrong moment, or fail to show it when it matters, people notice. Because loyalty in this world is not assumed. It's observed, tested, and remembered. So you become careful, even more careful than before. Because now it's not just about avoiding mistakes. It's about proving over and over again that you are not a risk, that you belong, that you can be trusted. And if you fail to do that, you won't be corrected, you'll be removed. Because in a castle, loyalty is not optional. It's survival. By now you've learned something deeply uncomfortable. Survival in a medieval castle is not about being impressive. It's about being forgettable, which goes against everything your brain naturally wants to do. Because normally being noticed is good. It means you matter. It means people see you, remember you, maybe even value you. Here, being noticed is risky, because attention brings scrutiny. And scrutiny never ends well for someone in your position. Now, this doesn't mean you disappear completely. That would also be suspicious. If you suddenly become too quiet, too still, too invisible, people start asking a different set of questions. Why is he hiding? What is he avoiding? What is he thinking? Which means you're stuck in another impossible balance. Visible, but not memorable. Present, but not important. You exist in the background, like part of the structure of the room itself. People see you, but they don't focus on you. You're there, but not in a way that demands attention. And achieving that is harder than anything you've done so far. Because everything you do has the potential to stand out. Laugh too loudly? Memorable. Speak too clearly? Memorable. Move too quickly? Memorable. Even something as simple as standing in the wrong place for too long can make people notice you. And once you're noticed, you don't go back to being invisible. You become someone people watch. And being watched means everything you do is now under a microscope. Every word, every reaction, every small mistake you make becomes more significant, more visible, more likely to be remembered. And memory in a castle is dangerous, because people remember patterns, and patterns become judgments. And judgments become consequences. So you learn to reduce yourself. Not completely, just enough. You keep your movements measured, your voice controlled, your presence neutral. You avoid extremes. You avoid drawing attention in any direction. You become balanced, carefully, deliberately balanced, which again is exhausting. Because now you're not just managing what you do, you're managing how much of it people notice. And that requires constant awareness. Constant adjustment, constant control, because the safest place in a medieval castle is not at the top and not at the bottom. It's somewhere in the middle, where you are seen, but not remembered. Because once you're remembered, you've already stepped into something far more dangerous than invisibility. Long before the violin became the soul of classical music, before it filled concert halls or carried emotion across centuries, it simply didn't exist. At least not in the form we recognize today. But the need for it was already quietly building. Across medieval Europe, music was everywhere, but it sounded different, rougher, less precise. Instruments like the rebec, the viol, and early fiddles were common, but they weren't designed for subtlety. They could entertain, accompany, and even impress, but they couldn't truly speak. And that was the problem. Because as music evolved, expectations began to rise. Courts no longer wanted just background noise during feasts. Churches no longer wanted simple tones echoing through stone walls. Composers were starting to chase something more ambitious. Expression, depth, something that could mirror human emotion rather than just decorate it. The existing instruments weren't enough. The rebec, for example, had a sharp, nasal tone. Effective, yes. Beautiful, debatable. The viol was more versatile, but still lacked the refinement needed for the increasingly complex music being imagined. These instruments were practical, but they were not transformative, and that gap became impossible to ignore. Musicians wanted an instrument that could do more than just produce sound. They wanted something that could cry, whisper, tremble, and sing. Something that could move an audience without a single word being spoken. But creating something like that wasn't simple. It required precision, balance, an understanding of wood, tension, resonance, things that couldn't just be guessed. It required craftsmanship that bordered on obsession. And that kind of craftsmanship was beginning to emerge in one particular place, Cremona. At the time, Cremona was just another Italian city, not famous, not particularly dominant, but within its workshops, something unusual was happening. Craftsmen were experimenting, refining, quietly pushing the boundaries of what string instruments could be. They weren't trying to invent the violin overnight. They were solving problems. How do you make the sound richer? How do you make the instrument more responsive? How do you give it a voice that feels alive? Each small improvement brought them closer to something new, something that hadn't yet been fully realized, but was starting to take shape. And without realizing it, these early craftsmen were standing on the edge of a transformation. Because the violin wasn't born suddenly. It was built, piece by piece, from centuries of trial, error, and quiet ambition. And soon, in the hands of the right makers, it would become something the world had never heard before. In Cremona, something unusual was happening inside small, quiet workshops. These weren't loud places filled with spectacle. They were controlled environments where every cut of wood, every curve, every measurement mattered more than it seemed. Because this wasn't just instrument making. This was experimentation. Early luthiers, the craftsmen who built string instruments, began refining older designs, especially those inspired by the viol family. They adjusted shapes, changed proportions, tested different woods. Maple for the back, spruce for the top. Not randomly, but because these materials responded in ways that felt promising. And here's where it gets interesting. They weren't chasing volume, They were chasing quality, a richer tone, a clearer response, a sound that didn't just exist but projected, something that could carry across a room and still feel intimate. Among the earliest names tied to this transformation was Andrea Amati, often considered one of the first true makers of the violin as we know it. His instruments were smaller, more refined, more balanced than their predecessors. The shape began to settle into something recognizable. Elegant curves, a narrow waist, a structure designed not just for sound, but for control. And that control changed everything, because suddenly the instrument wasn't just being played, it was being expressed through. The bow, another crucial development, allowed for sustained notes, dynamic shifts, subtle variations in pressure. No longer limited to plucked or short tones, musicians could now draw sound out, shape it, stretch it. And for the first time, the instrument began to resemble something alive. But perfection didn't come instantly. Each violin was slightly different. Each experiment carried risk. Some sounded incredible, others less so. But the process continued, driven by a kind of quiet obsession that only true craftsmen understand. And slowly a standard began to emerge. A shape that worked, a balance that felt right, a sound that hinted at something greater. Cremona wasn't just building instruments anymore, it was defining them, and what started as a series of small improvements was now becoming something unmistakable. An instrument that didn't just accompany music, but had the potential to lead it. As the violin's shape began to settle in Cremona, something even more important emerged: mastery. Because designing a good instrument is one thing, perfecting it is something else entirely. And this is where the story shifts from experimentation to obsession. The early work of Andrea Amati had laid the foundation, but it was the generations that followed who would elevate the violin from a promising instrument into something almost mythical. Workshops in Cremona became places of quiet intensity, where knowledge wasn't just taught, it was guarded, refined and passed down like a secret language. Families of luthiers began to dominate the craft. The Amati family continued to refine proportions, smoothing out imperfections, chasing balance between strength and sensitivity. Their violins were elegant, controlled, almost polite in their tone, the kind of sound that fit perfectly within the courts of Europe. But then came a shift. A new generation of makers began pushing beyond refinement toward power. Among them was Antonio Stradivari, a name that would eventually become synonymous with perfection. His violins weren't just well made, they were different. Stronger projection, greater clarity, a tone that could cut through space without losing warmth, and perhaps most importantly, consistency. Stradivari seemed to understand something others were still chasing: how to control every variable, the arching of the wood, the thickness of the plates, the varnish, the exact placement of the F-holes. Nothing was accidental. Every detail served a purpose, even if that purpose couldn't always be explained. And then there was Giuseppe Guarneri, whose instruments took a slightly different path. Where Stradivari aimed for balance and brilliance, Guarneri's violins were darker, more aggressive, almost unpredictable. Not worse, just different. And for some players, that difference was everything. What's fascinating is this: no one fully understands why these instruments sound the way they do. Centuries later, experts still study them, measure them, try to replicate them. And while modern violins can come close, sometimes very close, there's still a lingering belief that something about those Cremonese instruments remains unmatched. Maybe it's the wood, maybe the varnish, maybe the craftsmanship, or maybe it's the fact that they were built during a moment when art, science, and obsession collided perfectly. Either way, by the time these masters were finished, the violin was no longer just an instrument, it was an ideal, and now it needed something else, someone to prove what it could truly do. By the time the great makers of Cremona had refined the violin into something near perfection, one question still remained: what was it truly capable of? An instrument, no matter how beautifully crafted, is only as powerful as the hands that bring it to life. And for a time, the violin was still finding its place, used in ensembles, supporting voices, adding colour, but not yet fully standing at the centre. That was about to change. As music entered the late 17th and early 18th centuries, composers began to realise something extraordinary. The violin wasn't limited to accompaniment. It could lead. It could carry entire pieces on its own, shifting from delicate whispers to intense, almost vocal cries in a way few instruments could match. And one of the first to truly understand this was Arcangelo Corelli. Corelli didn't just write for the violin, he wrote through it. His compositions explored its range, its expressive potential, its ability to hold attention without support. Under his influence, the violin began stepping forward, moving from the background into the spotlight. And once that door opened, others followed. Then came Antonio Vivaldi, a composer who seemed determined to test just how far the violin could go. Fast passages, dramatic contrasts, vivid imagery. His works, like the Four Seasons, didn't just use the violin, they transformed it into a storyteller. Suddenly, the instrument could imitate storms, birds, flowing water. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was narrative. And audiences noticed. The violin became exciting, unpredictable, capable of capturing attention in a way that felt new. Performers began pushing themselves as well, developing techniques that would have been unthinkable just decades earlier. Faster bowing, more complex fingerwork, greater control over dynamics. The instrument was evolving alongside the music. But with this rise came a new kind of figure, the virtuoso. Not just a musician, but a performer whose skill seemed almost impossible. Someone who didn't just play the violin, but dominated it, bending it to their will, showing audiences what the instrument could do at its absolute limits. And as these performers emerged, the violin's identity became clear. It wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was a voice, capable of expressing joy, sorrow, tension, beauty, all within a single line of music. But as powerful as that voice had become, it was still only beginning. Because soon, someone would come along who wouldn't just master the violin. He would make it seem almost supernatural. By the early 19th century, the violin had already proven itself. Refined in Cremona, elevated by composers, and embraced by audiences across Europe. It could lead orchestras, carry emotion, and dominate the stage. But then came someone who changed the perception of what was even possible. His name was Niccolò Paganini, and if the violin had found its voice before, Paganini turned it into something almost unreal. From the moment he stepped onto a stage, there was something different about him. Tall, thin, almost ghost-like in appearance, with long fingers that seemed designed specifically for the instrument. He didn't just play the violin, he attacked it, controlled it, pushed it beyond limits that other musicians didn't even attempt. And the sounds he produced? They didn't make sense. He played faster than anyone had seen, cleanly, effortlessly. He used techniques that seemed impossible. Rapid passages, harmonics that sounded like multiple instruments at once, playing on a single string as if the others were unnecessary. Audiences were stunned. And when people can't explain something, they tend to create explanations. Rumours began to spread that Paganini had made a deal with the devil, that no human could possess that level of skill without assistance. It sounds dramatic, but in an era where the supernatural still felt close to everyday life, many believed it. Paganini, of course, didn't exactly try to correct them. If anything, he leaned into the mystery. But behind the legend was something more grounded and far more impressive. Relentless dedication. Paganini had taken the violin and treated it not as a fixed instrument, but as something expandable. He explored every corner of its potential, inventing techniques, refining control, and pushing his own body to keep up with what he imagined. He didn't accept limitations, and because of that, the violin itself seemed to evolve again. After Paganini, the standard changed. What was once considered virtuosic became expected. Future violinists had to adapt, to rise to a new level that he had essentially forced into existence. And more importantly, audiences began to see the violin differently, not just as an instrument of beauty, but as an instrument of power, something capable of overwhelming skill, dramatic intensity, and almost theatrical performance. Paganini didn't just play the violin, he transformed it into a spectacle, and in doing so, he ensured that the violin would never again be seen as quiet, delicate, or limited. It had become something far more dangerous, and far more captivating. After Niccolò Paganini, the violin was no longer just respected. It was feared, admired, and expected to deliver something extraordinary. But just as the instrument reached new technical heights, the world around it began to change. Music was no longer confined to royal courts or private salons. The old system, where composers and musicians depended on aristocrats for support, was slowly fading. In its place, something new was emerging. Public concerts, large audiences, ticket sales, independent performers, and the violin was perfectly positioned to thrive in this new world. Its sound could carry across a hall. Its range allowed it to stand alone or blend seamlessly with an orchestra. And perhaps most importantly, it had already proven that it could captivate an audience on its own. Composers began writing with this in mind. Ludwig van Beethoven pushed the violin into deeper emotional territory, demanding not just technical skill, but intensity and expression. His violin concerto wasn't just a piece to be played, it was something to be endured, navigated, and ultimately conquered. Then came Johannes Brahms, who added weight and richness, treating the violin not as a light, decorative instrument, but as something capable of profound depth. His works required patience, control, and an understanding that went beyond technique. And alongside them, performers continued to evolve. Violinists were no longer just musicians. They were public figures, touring artists, specialists whose identities were tied to the instrument itself. The idea of the soloist became central, and the violin sat at the heart of that role. Concert halls replaced courts. Applause replaced patronage. But this shift came with its own pressure. Because now, instead of pleasing a small group of elites, violinists had to connect with entire audiences. People with different tastes, expectations, and attention spans. The performance wasn't just about precision anymore. It was about presence. Emotion had to be visible. Energy had to be sustained. And the violin, once a carefully crafted object in a quiet Cremonese workshop, had now become something far larger. A bridge between composer and audience, between technique and feeling, between control and chaos. It had survived its birth, its refinement, and its transformation into a virtuoso instrument. Now, it was stepping fully into its role as the voice of an entire musical era. And yet, even with all this evolution, one thing remained constant. The violin still demanded everything from the person holding it, and not everyone was ready to give that much. By the time the violin dominated concert halls across Europe, it had already earned its reputation as one of the most expressive instruments ever created. But behind that beauty, behind every effortless performance, there was something far less graceful. Struggle, because the violin, for all its elegance, is unforgiving. Unlike many instruments, it offers no shortcuts. There are no frets to guide the fingers, no fixed notes to rely on. Every pitch must be found precisely, adjusted constantly, controlled in real time. A fraction too high and it sounds strained, a fraction too low and it collapses. And that's just the beginning. The bow, the very thing that gives the violin its voice, requires its own level of mastery. Pressure, speed, angle, contact. Each movement changes the sound completely. Too much force and the tone breaks. Too little and it fades into nothing. Which means that learning the violin isn't just difficult. It's relentless. Young students often spend years producing sounds that can only be described as discouraging. Not because they lack talent, but because the instrument demands something deeper than talent. It demands patience, discipline, and a tolerance for frustration that most people simply don't have. And yet, those who persist begin to understand something important. The difficulty is the point, because the violin doesn't just respond to technique, it reflects the person playing it. Tension, hesitation, confidence, control, all of it becomes audible. You can't hide behind the instrument. It exposes you. This is why mastery takes decades. Even the greatest violinists never truly finish learning. They refine, adjust, relearn. A passage that worked yesterday might feel different today. A tone that seemed perfect can always be improved. Perfection in this world is not a destination. It's a moving target. And that's what makes the violin so unique. It doesn't reward shortcuts. It doesn't tolerate complacency. It forces musicians into a constant dialogue with themselves. A process that is as psychological as it is technical. But for those who reach a high level, something shifts. The struggle begins to disappear, at least on the surface. Movements become fluid. Sound becomes intentional. The effort that once felt overwhelming becomes invisible to the audience, and that's when the illusion is created, because what looks effortless on stage is almost always built on years of frustration, repetition, and quiet persistence behind the scenes. The violin doesn't just demand skill, it demands commitment, and for those willing to give it everything, it offers something rare in return, a voice that feels entirely their own. By the 20th century, the violin had already lived several lives. It had been born in the workshops of Cremona, shaped by obsessive craftsmen, elevated by composers, and pushed to its limits by virtuosos like Niccolò Paganini. It had survived courts, revolutions, shifting audiences, and the rise of the modern concert hall. And yet, it didn't disappear. It adapted. Because while many classical traditions began to fade or become confined to niche audiences, the violin did something unusual. It stepped outside its own world. It entered new genres. Folk traditions across Europe had always used violin-like instruments, but now the modern violin began blending into styles far beyond classical music. It appeared in Eastern European dances, Irish reels, Balkan melodies, each culture reshaping the instrument's voice to fit its own identity. The same instrument, completely different sound. Then came jazz. Suddenly, the violin wasn't just precise, it was improvisational, flexible, unpredictable. Players began bending notes, experimenting with rhythm, treating the violin less like a strict classical tool and more like a creative extension of themselves. And then, eventually, it reached modern genres. Rock, film scores, even experimental electronic music. The violin proved something remarkable. It wasn't limited by tradition. It could evolve without losing its identity. At the same time, the instrument itself saw subtle changes. Materials improved. Construction became more consistent. Electric violins emerged, allowing amplification and effects that would have been unimaginable in earlier centuries. But here's the interesting part. Despite all this innovation, the core design barely changed. The shape developed in Cremona remained. The structure, the proportions, the balance, all of it was so effective that it didn't need reinvention. Modern makers refined it, yes, but they didn't replace it, which is rare. Most tools evolve dramatically over time. The violin didn't have to. And in the concert world, it still held its position at the centre. Orchestras continued to rely on it. Soloists continued to build careers around it. Composers continued to write for it, even as musical styles expanded in every direction. Because no matter how much music changed, one thing remained true. The violin could still do something few instruments could. It could feel human. Not just in sound, but in expression, in nuance, in its ability to shift between strength and fragility within a single phrase. And that's why, even in a modern world filled with new technology and endless options, the violin didn't become outdated. It remained relevant, because it wasn't just an instrument of the past. It was, and still is, an instrument of emotion. After centuries of evolution, from the early experiments in Cremona to the brilliance of virtuosos and the expansion into modern music, the violin stands in a position few instruments ever reach. It is no longer just part of music. It defines it. What makes the violin so powerful isn't just its history, or the craftsmanship behind it, or even the legendary figures who mastered it. It's something far less tangible, something that can't be measured or fully explained. It feels human. More than almost any other instrument, the violin mirrors the human voice. It can cry without words, laugh without sound, tremble with uncertainty, or rise with confidence. A single note can carry tension. A phrase can feel like a conversation, and an entire performance can unfold like a story, even without a single lyric. That's not an accident. From the very beginning, the violin was shaped to respond to touch, to react instantly to pressure, speed, and intention. It doesn't produce sound on its own. It reflects the person holding it. Every movement, every hesitation, every moment of control or loss of control becomes part of what the audience hears, which means no two performances are ever truly the same, even when playing the exact same piece. That's why a violin in the hands of a beginner can sound harsh, unstable, almost resistant, while the same instrument in the hands of a master can feel effortless, alive, almost emotional, in a way that's difficult to describe. The difference isn't the instrument, it's the connection. And that connection is what has allowed the violin to survive everything. Changing tastes, new technologies, shifting audiences. While other instruments rise and fall in popularity, the violin remains constant because it offers something deeper than novelty. It offers expression, not just technical expression, but emotional honesty. It forces the musician to confront precision and feeling at the same time. It demands control but rewards vulnerability. And perhaps that's the real reason it has endured, because in a world where music constantly evolves, where styles come and go, the need to express something real, something human, never disappears. The violin doesn't just produce sound, it translates emotion. And that is why, from its quiet beginnings to the largest stages in the world, it has become more than an instrument. It has become a voice, one that, centuries later, is still being heard. Long before the great empires of Greece and Rome, before philosophers and conquerors shaped the Mediterranean world, there was an island civilization that seemed to exist in a different rhythm, quieter, more fluid, almost peaceful. On the island of Crete, surrounded by the deep blue of the Aegean Sea, the Minoan Civilization began to take shape. And unlike many ancient cultures, it didn't start with war. It started with trade. Crete's position made it a natural crossroads between Egypt, the Near East, and mainland Greece. Ships came and went, carrying goods, ideas, and influences. Over time, small settlements grew into organized communities, and those communities into something far more complex. But here's what makes the Minoans unusual. They didn't build massive defensive walls, no towering fortresses, no clear signs of constant warfare, which is strange. Because most ancient civilizations were built around survival through strength, protection, conflict. But the Minoans seemed to rely on something else. Control of the sea, economic power, and perhaps a level of stability that other cultures struggled to achieve. Instead of walls, they built something different. Palaces, not simple residences, but vast, intricate complexes filled with corridors, storage rooms, workshops, and open courtyards. Places like Knossos weren't just homes for rulers, they were centres of administration, trade, and daily life. And they were complex, almost confusingly so. Hallways twisted. Rooms connected in unexpected ways. Levels shifted. It wasn't designed like a simple structure. It felt more like a maze, which is where the story begins to blur into legend. Because centuries later, the Greeks would remember Crete not just as a place, but as the setting of a myth. A labyrinth, a creature hidden within it, a king, and something monstrous beneath his palace. The story of the Minotaur may not be literal history, but it reflects something real. The impression these structures left behind. They weren't just buildings, they were overwhelming. And for a civilization that left no grand war records, no clear accounts of kings or conquests, that's what remains most striking. They built beauty, complexity, and art in a world that usually prioritized survival. Which raises a question that historians are still trying to answer. Who were the Minoans, really? And how did such a civilization rise, only to disappear almost entirely from memory? At the heart of the Minoan civilization stood structures unlike anything else in the ancient world. Not fortresses, not temples in the traditional sense, but vast living systems of activity. The most famous of these was Knossos, and calling it a palace almost feels misleading, because this wasn't just where a ruler lived. It was a centre of administration, storage, religion, and daily life, all woven together into a single sprawling complex. Hundreds of rooms, multiple levels, staircases that seemed to lead everywhere and nowhere at once. It didn't feel organised. It felt alive. Corridors twisted in unexpected directions. Rooms opened into courtyards, then narrowed again into tight passages. Light wells brought sunlight into the interior, creating shifting patterns of brightness and shadow throughout the day. And perhaps most surprising of all, there were no defensive walls surrounding it. In a time when most centres of power were heavily fortified, Knossos stood open, exposed, almost confident in its safety, which suggests something unusual. The Minoans may not have relied on walls because they didn't need to. Their strength likely came from the sea, a powerful maritime network that allowed them to control trade routes, project influence, and avoid constant invasion. In other words, their protection wasn't built in stone, it was built in movement. Inside the palace, the scale of organisation becomes clear. Large storage rooms held massive clay jars known as pithoi, used to store oil, grain, wine, resources that supported not just the palace, but the wider population. Workshops buzzed with activity, craftsman-shaped pottery, metal, textiles. This wasn't just a residence, it was an economic engine. And then there were the walls. Not bare, not defensive, but painted. Frescoes covered surfaces with scenes of nature, ceremonies, and human activity. Bright colours, flowing movement, images of people interacting with the world rather than dominating it. No constant battle scenes, no glorification of war. Just life, and that might be the most revealing detail of all. Because while other civilizations carved victories into stone, the Minoans painted motion, rhythm, and connection. Their art suggests a culture that valued experience over conquest. But there's a tension here, because a society this open, this interconnected, this dependent on trade and stability, is also vulnerable. And while Knossos may have stood without walls for a time, the question remains: what happens to a civilization built on balance, when that balance is disrupted? If the palaces of the Minoan civilization reveal how the Minoans lived, their art reveals how they felt. And it's immediately different. In a world where many ancient cultures focused on power, conquest, and rigid order, the Minoans created something far more fluid. Their frescoes, found in places like Knossos, are filled with motion. Figures don't stand still. They twist, leap, dance. Even nature itself seems alive, almost in motion. There's energy everywhere. You see dolphins swimming across walls, flowing lines of waves, people engaged in rituals that feel more like performances than formal ceremonies. It doesn't look static. It doesn't look controlled. It looks alive. And then there's one of the most famous scenes, bull leaping. Young figures, both male and female, are shown vaulting over charging bulls, gripping horns, flipping through the air, landing behind the animal in a display that feels equal parts athletic and symbolic. It's not just a sport, it's something deeper, a ritual perhaps, a test of courage, a moment where humans and nature meet in a kind of controlled chaos. And what stands out is not fear, it's confidence. The Minoans didn't seem to depict themselves as struggling against the world. They appear integrated with it, moving through it, engaging with it, almost celebrating it. Even their depictions of people feel different. Women appear prominently in Minoan art, often dressed in elaborate clothing, participating in rituals, occupying visible roles. This has led many historians to believe that Minoan society may have had a different social structure compared to other ancient cultures, possibly giving women a more active or visible position. Not necessarily equal in a modern sense, but certainly not invisible. And then there's the absence. No large-scale war scenes. No kings towering over defeated enemies. No obvious glorification of violence. That doesn't mean conflict didn't exist, but it wasn't the centre of their identity. Instead, their art suggests a culture focused on experience, movement, nature, ritual, and expression. But here's where things become uncertain, because art can tell us what a civilization wanted to show, not necessarily everything it was. The Minoans left behind no clear written records we can fully understand. Their script, known as Linear A, remains largely undeciphered, which means their voice, their own explanation of who they were, is still out of reach. We see their world through images, through fragments, through interpretation, and while those images suggest a society full of colour, rhythm, and balance, they also leave us with a question. What lies beneath a culture that appears so harmonious on the surface, and how much of that harmony was real, and how much was simply what they chose to leave behind? If Minoan art shows us movement, then Minoan religion shows us something deeper, something harder to define. Because unlike civilizations that left behind clear temples, named gods, and written myths, the Minoan civilization left us something far more uncertain. Fragments, images of rituals, symbols repeated across walls and objects, spaces that feel sacred, but without clear explanations. And at the centre of it all, one image appears again and again: the bull. In places like Knossos, bulls are everywhere. in frescoes, carvings, and ceremonial objects, not just as animals, but as something symbolic, powerful, almost sacred. The bull leaping scenes we saw earlier likely weren't just performances. They may have been rituals, dangerous, controlled encounters that carried meaning beyond spectacle. And then there's the double axe. Known as the labris, this symbol appears frequently in Minoan sites. Its exact meaning isn't fully understood, but it's often associated with religious spaces, suggesting it held ceremonial or spiritual importance. Together, these elements hint at a belief system centered on nature, strength, and transformation. Not rigid gods sitting above humanity, but forces that humans interacted with directly. And then there are the figures. Statues of women, often called snake goddesses, have been discovered, holding serpents, standing upright, dressed in elaborate clothing. Whether they were actual deities, priestesses, or symbolic representations is still debated. But one thing is clear, female figures held significance, which again sets the Minoans apart from many other ancient cultures, where male gods and rulers dominated religious imagery. Their sacred spaces also feel different. Instead of massive temples dominating city skylines, Minoan religious activity often took place in smaller, more intimate settings. Caves, mountaintop shrines, hidden rooms within palaces, places that feel private, almost secret. And this brings us back to the idea of the labyrinth. The Greeks later told stories of a vast maze beneath the palace of Knossos, home to the Minotaur, a creature that was part man, part bull. It's almost certainly a myth, but like many myths, it may be rooted in something real. The complexity of the palaces, the importance of the bull, the sense of hidden spaces and rituals not fully understood, all of it feeds into the same impression. This was a civilization that didn't make everything visible. Their beliefs weren't written clearly. Their rituals weren't explained. Their symbols were left behind without instructions. And so what we're left with is not a complete picture, but a series of glimpses of the people who interacted with something they considered sacred, something tied to nature, to movement, to power, something that, even now, remains just out of reach. If the Minoan civilization built their world without walls, then the question becomes obvious. What protected them? The answer wasn't stone. It was the sea. From their island base on Crete, the Minoans developed something that few other early civilizations could match: control over maritime trade. Their ships moved across the Aegean with confidence, connecting distant regions and turning the sea into something less like a barrier and more like a highway. And through that highway, they built influence. Artifacts found across the Mediterranean suggest that Minoan goods, pottery, textiles, metals, travelled far beyond Crete. They traded with places like ancient Egypt and the Near East, exchanging materials, techniques, and ideas. But trade wasn't just about goods. It was about connection. The Minoans became intermediaries, linking different cultures together. And in doing so, they didn't just grow wealth. They shaped the flow of information and influence across the region, which may explain something important: their apparent lack of heavy fortifications. If you control the sea, you control access. If your ships dominate trade routes, you reduce the need for constant defense on land. Power, in this case, didn't come from armies standing at gates. It came from movement, reach, and presence. This idea has led historians to describe Minoan power as a form of thalassocracy, a sea-based dominance rather than a land-based empire. But power like this comes with its own risks, because it depends on stability, stable routes, predictable conditions, reliable connections. And the sea, for all its advantages, is not always predictable. Storms can disrupt travel, routes can shift. External forces, other rising civilizations, can challenge control. And if that network weakens, the entire system begins to strain. There's also another question. Was their dominance truly peaceful? The lack of clear war imagery suggests a different approach to power, but that doesn't necessarily mean conflict didn't exist. It may have been less visible, less recorded, or simply expressed in ways we don't fully understand, because control, even of trade, often requires enforcement. Still, what remains remarkable is how the Minoans chose to present themselves, not as conquerors, not as destroyers, but as participants in a connected world. a civilization that thrived not by isolating itself, but by engaging with others. And for a time it worked. The sea carried their influence far and wide, turning Crete into the centre of something much larger than itself. But the same sea that brought them power would not be the thing that brought them down. For a time, the world of the Minoan civilization seemed stable, balanced between trade, culture, and a quiet kind of power that didn't rely on constant warfare. But no system like that remains untouched forever, and slowly, almost quietly, the first cracks began to appear. At first they weren't obvious. Palaces continued to function. Trade routes still operated. Life, at least on the surface, seemed to continue as it always had. But beneath that surface, something was shifting. Something that would eventually destabilize everything the Minoans had built. And then came the event that may have changed everything. The eruption of Thera, one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in human history. It tore through the island now known as Santorini, sending ash high into the sky and triggering massive shockwaves across the region. The explosion itself was devastating, but its effects went far beyond the immediate destruction. Ash fell across the Aegean. The sea reacted. Tsunamis may have struck the coasts of Crete, damaging ports and coastal settlements, the very infrastructure that supported Minoan trade and influence. Even if the core of the civilization survived the initial impact, the disruption would have been severe, and more importantly, unpredictable, because the Minoans relied on stability, on consistent movement, reliable connections, and a network that functioned smoothly. A disaster like this doesn't just destroy structures, it interrupts systems. Trade slows, resources become uncertain, confidence weakens, and when a civilization is built on balance, disruption doesn't need to be total to be dangerous. But the eruption alone may not have been the end, because around the same period, another force was rising nearby, the Mycenaean civilization. Unlike the Minoans, the Mycenaeans were more openly militaristic, fortified cities, clear evidence of warfare, a different approach to power, one built less on connection and more on control. And as Minoan stability weakened, that difference began to matter. Archaeological evidence suggests that eventually, Minoan sites, including Knossos, came under Mycenaean influence or control. Whether through invasion, gradual takeover, or internal collapse remains debated. But the result is clear. The Minoan system changed, and once that change began, there was no returning to what it had been. Because civilizations don't always fall in a single moment. Sometimes they unravel, slowly, quietly, until what once felt permanent becomes something fragile, and for the Minoans, that process had already begun. By the time the effects of the Thera eruption had settled, the Minoan civilization was no longer the same. But what makes their decline so unsettling is this. There is no clear final battle, no single dramatic collapse, no obvious moment where everything ends. Instead, what we see is something far more ambiguous. Destruction layers appear in archaeological sites, burned sections of palaces, damaged structures, signs that something went wrong. But these events don't all happen at once. They're spread out, inconsistent, almost fragmented, and that makes the story harder to define. Because it suggests that the fall of the Minoans wasn't a single event, it was a process. Some palaces were destroyed and rebuilt, others were abandoned. Knossos itself continued to function for a time, but under different influences. The presence of the Mycenaean civilization becomes more visible. Their writing system, known as Linear B, appears where the undeciphered Minoan Linear A once dominated, which tells us something important. The culture didn't just disappear overnight. It was absorbed, transformed, gradually replaced. But even that explanation doesn't fully resolve the mystery, because we still don't know exactly how this transition happened. Was it invasion? Was it internal collapse after environmental disaster? Was it a slow loss of control over trade and resources? Or was it all of these things at once? The lack of clear answers creates a strange kind of silence around their ending, and that silence contrasts sharply with what we know about them. A civilization full of colour, movement, and life, fading without leaving behind a clear explanation. Even their writing adds to the mystery. Linear A remains undeciphered, which means we cannot read their records, their accounts, their own version of events. We see their world through architecture, art, and fragments, but we cannot hear their voice. And that absence matters, because it turns their fall into something almost invisible. Not a dramatic ending, but a quiet disappearance. Over time, their influence merged into the cultures that followed. Elements of Minoan art, religion and structure lived on, reshaped within Mycenaean society and later Greek traditions. But the identity itself, the distinct, recognizable Minoan world, was gone. Not destroyed in a single moment, but worn down, replaced, and eventually forgotten. And perhaps that's what makes their story so compelling. Because it reminds us that not all civilizations end with fire and conquest. Some simply fade, until all that remains are ruins, symbols, and questions. For thousands of years, the Minoan civilization was gone. Not just gone in the sense of decline, but gone from memory. No written histories clearly described them. No continuous tradition preserved their identity. What remained were only fragments of myth, scattered references, and ruins buried beneath time. To the ancient Greeks, Crete was a place of legend. They spoke of kings like Minos, of labyrinths beneath palaces, and of the Minotaur, a monster hidden at the centre of a maze. These stories carried echoes of something real, but over time, myth replaced memory. The true civilization behind those stories remained hidden until the modern era. In the early 20th century, a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans began excavating a site on Crete that would change everything. Knossos. What he uncovered was not just a ruin. It was a revelation. Walls covered in frescoes, complex architectural layouts, storage rooms, staircases, courtyards, all preserved beneath layers of earth. The scale and sophistication of the site made one thing immediately clear. This was not a minor culture. This was a civilization. Evans named them the Minoans, after the legendary King Minos, linking myth to archaeology in a way that still shapes how we understand them today. But his work also introduced controversy. In his attempts to reconstruct parts of Knossos, Evans made bold decisions, restoring walls, repainting frescoes, and interpreting structures based on his own theories. Some of these reconstructions helped bring the site to life. Others blurred the line between evidence and imagination, which means that even in rediscovery, the Minoans remain partially obscured. We see them through layers, ancient ruins, modern interpretation, fragments of myth, and then there's the writing. Clay tablets discovered at various sites revealed two scripts, Linear A and Linear B. While Linear B was eventually deciphered and linked to the Mycenaeans, Linear A remains a mystery. We still cannot read the Minoans' own words, which means that even after rediscovering their cities, their art, and their structures, something essential is still missing. Their voice. And so the Minoans exist in a strange space, not fully lost, not fully understood, a civilization brought back into awareness, but still holding on to its secrets. Even after their rediscovery, the Minoan civilization refuses to fully reveal itself. We have their palaces, like Knossos, their art, their symbols, their traces scattered across Crete and beyond. We have enough to recognize their presence, to admire their sophistication, to understand that they were not just another ancient culture, but one of the earliest complex civilizations in Europe. And yet, something is missing, because for all we have uncovered, we still don't truly know them. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know how they described their world. We don't know how they understood their own rise, or their fall. Their script, Linear A, remains undeciphered, a silent barrier between us and their thoughts. Every tablet discovered feels like a locked door, holding answers that we can see but not access. And that creates a strange kind of distance. Most civilizations leave behind a narrative, a voice that explains who they were, what they valued, what they feared. The Minoans left something different, an atmosphere, a sense of movement, colour and balance, a world where art flows, where structures feel alive, where power isn't always expressed through dominance. They feel less rigid than other ancient societies, less defined by conflict, more connected to rhythm and environment. But that impression comes with uncertainty, because without their own words, we are interpreting them through fragments, through what survived, through what we choose to emphasize. And interpretation is not the same as certainty. Still, their influence lingers. Elements of Minoan culture appear in later Greek traditions, in myth, in symbolism, in stories that survived long after the civilization itself faded. The legend of the labyrinth, the image of the bull, the idea of a powerful island kingdom, all of it echoes something real, even if it has been reshaped over time. Which means the Minoans were not truly erased. They were transformed, absorbed into the cultural memory of those who came after them, even as their identity became less clear. And perhaps that is their most lasting legacy. Not a single defining moment, not a clear narrative, but a presence. A civilization that doesn't shout through history, but whispers through it, in ruins, in myths, in unanswered questions. And maybe that's why they continue to fascinate us. Because in a world where so much has been explained, categorized, and understood, the Minoans remain just out of reach, close enough to see, but distant enough to remain a mystery. In the winter of 1756, in the quiet city of Salzburg, a child was born into a house that already sounded like a rehearsal hall. His name was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and unlike most children, he didn't grow into music. He seemed to arrive already carrying it. His father, Leopold Mozart, was a respected violinist and teacher, but more importantly, a man who recognized something unusual almost immediately. This wasn't just talent. This was the kind of ability that makes other musicians quietly reconsider their life choices. By the age of 3, Wolfgang was already reaching for the clavichord, tapping out notes with tiny fingers that had no business being that precise. By 5, he wasn't just playing, he was composing. Actual pieces, structured, intentional. The kind of thing most adults struggle to fake convincingly. Leopold didn't waste time. He began training Wolfgang with the intensity of someone who knew he was holding something rare and fragile. Lessons were not optional. Discipline was not negotiable. Childhood, as most people understand it, was quietly removed from the schedule. But here's the strange part. Wolfgang didn't seem to mind. He absorbed music the way others absorb language. Complex harmonies made sense to him before basic arithmetic probably did. He could hear a piece once and reproduce it, not approximately, not close enough, exactly, which, for anyone else in the room, was both impressive and slightly unsettling. Soon, the small apartment in Salzburg wasn't enough. Leopold began taking Wolfgang, along with his equally talented sister, across Europe. Royal courts, aristocratic salons, crowded halls. The child became a spectacle, not in a circus way, but close enough. People gathered to witness what felt like a glitch in reality. A boy who could outperform seasoned musicians without even looking particularly stressed about it. And while audiences applauded, something else was quietly forming beneath the surface. Expectation. Because when a child becomes a prodigy, the world stops asking, what will he become? And starts demanding, what will he prove next? And Wolfgang, whether he realized it yet or not, had just stepped onto a stage he would never be allowed to leave. By the time Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart turned 6, his life no longer resembled anything close to normal. While other children in Salzburg were learning basic manners and trying not to spill soup, Wolfgang was being dressed up and presented before royalty, expected to perform flawlessly, on command, like a tiny powdered miracle. His father, Leopold Mozart, had a clear vision. Europe would not come to Salzburg, so Salzburg would go to Europe. And just like that, the Mozart family packed their lives into carriages and set off on what would become years of relentless travel. Court after court, city after city, Vienna, Paris, London. Each destination brought new audiences, new expectations, and the same silent question hanging in the air. Is he really that good? He was. Wolfgang would walk into grand halls filled with nobles who had heard every performance imaginable, and then casually outperform their expectations before dessert was even served. He played blindfolded. He improvised on the spot. He mimicked styles of famous composers after hearing them once, as if he were politely showing them how their own music could be improved. Naturally, this made people both amazed and slightly uncomfortable. In Vienna, he reportedly climbed onto the lap of Maria Theresa as a child, treating imperial protocol like a mild suggestion. It was charming, mostly because he was too young to understand how inappropriate that actually was. If an adult had tried it, they would have been escorted out. Quickly! But beneath the applause, the reality was less glamorous. The roads were long, the weather was brutal, Illness followed them like an uninvited guest. Money, despite the prestige, was inconsistent. For all the admiration Wolfgang received, it didn't always translate into security. Applause, it turns out, does not pay bills, a lesson he would keep relearning for the rest of his life. And then there was the pressure, because each performance wasn't just a concert, it was proof that he was still extraordinary, proof that the miracle hadn't faded, proof that the child prodigy hadn't suddenly become just a child. And so he played, not because he had to be forced, but because it was the only thing that truly made sense to him. But as the tours stretched on and the novelty slowly began to wear thin, a quiet, uncomfortable truth started to emerge. The world loved a prodigy, but it had no idea what to do with a genius who was growing up. As Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart grew older, something subtle but dangerous began to change. He was no longer just the charming child who impressed courts with effortless brilliance. He was becoming an adult, and with that came a problem no one had prepared for. A prodigy can be controlled, a genius not so much. Back in Salzburg, Wolfgang found himself employed under Hieronymus Colloredo, a man who valued music, but mostly as background decoration for his own importance. For Colloredo, Mozart wasn't a revolutionary artist. He was staff, replaceable. Expected to follow orders, compose on demand, and ideally not develop opinions. This did not go well. Wolfgang had spent his childhood performing for kings, dazzling Europe, and being treated like something extraordinary. Now he was expected to sit quietly, write what he was told, and behave like a well-trained employee. It was, to put it mildly, not his preferred lifestyle. Tension grew quickly. Colloredo wanted obedience. Mozart wanted freedom. Colloredo wanted control. Mozart wanted expression. Colloredo saw a servant. Mozart saw himself as something far greater. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Mozart was right, but being right doesn't mean you win. Wolfgang began pushing boundaries, refusing to be treated as just another court musician. He travelled without permission, he argued. He resisted. And in a world where hierarchy was everything, this kind of behaviour wasn't seen as bold. It was seen as disrespectful. The breaking point came in Vienna. After one too many conflicts, Mozart was dismissed from the Archbishop's service. Not politely, not ceremoniously. According to accounts, he was literally kicked out, dismissed with an insult that made it very clear where he stood in the social order. For most people, this would have been a disaster. For Mozart, it was something else entirely. Freedom. For the first time in his life, he was no longer under his father's constant direction or a noble's authority. No schedule, no leash. No one telling him what he could or couldn't create. Which sounds great, until you realise what he had just lost. Stability, income, protection. Because in 18th century Europe, being a freelance artist wasn't a bold career move. It was closer to financial roulette. And Mozart had just placed his entire life on the table. Still, he didn't hesitate. He chose Vienna. He chose independence. He chose risk. And as history would prove, he also chose a path that would lead him to create some of the most extraordinary music ever written, while slowly walking toward a life that would never be as secure as it once seemed. When Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart arrived in Vienna as a free man, it must have felt like stepping onto the grandest stage in Europe. This was the cultural heart of the continent, a city filled with aristocrats, musicians, and endless opportunity. If you were going to prove your genius anywhere, this was the place, and at first it worked. Mozart quickly made a name for himself. His piano performances were electric, not in a loud, chaotic way, but in that unsettling, precise way where every note feels inevitable. Audiences were stunned. He improvised effortlessly, outplayed rivals, and composed with a speed that made other composers look like they were politely taking their time. Money began to flow in, not consistently, but enough to create the illusion of stability. He rented a comfortable apartment. He dressed well. He moved through Vienna like a man who had finally arrived. And in 1782 he married Constanze Mozart, a decision that his father, unsurprisingly, did not approve of. But Wolfgang was done asking for permission. For a brief moment, it looked like everything had aligned. And then reality caught up. Because Vienna was not just full of opportunity, it was full of competition. Talented composers were everywhere, all trying to secure the same patrons, the same commissions, the same attention. And Mozart, despite his brilliance, had one critical flaw. He didn't play the game. He wasn't particularly good at networking in the way society expected. He didn't flatter the right people consistently. He didn't always follow trends. And perhaps worst of all, he didn't simplify his music to make it easier for casual audiences. His work was brilliant, but sometimes too complex, too demanding, too ahead. And audiences, as it turns out, don't always reward genius immediately. Sometimes they just move on to something easier to digest. Financial problems began creeping in, quietly at first, then more aggressively. The comfortable lifestyle became harder to maintain. Debts appeared. Letters asking for money became more frequent. And the same man who had once performed for kings was now struggling to keep up appearances in a city that was slowly losing interest. But creatively, he was unstoppable. This period saw the creation of masterpieces, works that would outlive every critic, every rival, every fleeting trend in Vienna. Operas, symphonies, concertos, each one pushing boundaries, each one refusing to settle for mediocrity. So here's the contradiction. Mozart was producing some of the greatest music ever written, while his own life was becoming increasingly unstable. And the gap between those two realities was only getting wider. By the mid-1780s, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart had secured something rare in Vienna: recognition. Not universal admiration, not overwhelming wealth, but enough attention to be noticed, and more importantly, enough to attract rivals. Because success, even partial success, tends to do that. Among the names often tied to Mozart's story is Antonio Salieri, a respected and well-established composer at the imperial court. Unlike Mozart, Salieri understood the system. He navigated court politics carefully, built relationships, and maintained a stable position within Vienna's musical hierarchy. Naturally, this created a contrast that history would later exaggerate into something far more dramatic. Were they rivals? Yes. Was it a personal war filled with sabotage and jealousy? Probably not in the way later stories suggest. But here's the truth that matters. Mozart felt the competition. Vienna was a city where reputation could shift quickly. One successful opera could elevate you, the next could quietly disappear. And Mozart, for all his brilliance, didn't always win the crowd immediately. His music demanded attention, patience, and a level of understanding that not every audience was willing to give. Take The Marriage of Figaro, for example. Today it's considered a masterpiece. At the time, it stirred both admiration and controversy. Its themes, social tension, class dynamics, subtle rebellion, made it more than just entertainment. It made it uncomfortable, and uncomfortable art doesn't always get immediate applause. Then came Don Giovanni, darker, more intense, blending humour with something almost unsettling. Again, brilliant. Again, not universally embraced at first. Mozart was walking a strange line. He was too innovative to be easily accepted, yet too visible to be ignored. And in that space, rumours began to grow. Whispers of jealousy, stories of enemies, the idea that others were working against him. Some of it may have been real, much of it was likely exaggerated. But for Mozart, perception mattered just as much as reality. And the more pressure he felt, financially, socially, creatively, the more those shadows seemed to close in. Meanwhile, his lifestyle didn't help. He spent money freely when he had it, lived as if success would always return, and struggled to adjust when it didn't. Debt became a recurring theme. Letters asking for loans became more urgent, and the image of the confident, rising composer began to crack. Yet through all of this, one thing remained constant. The music kept getting better, sharper, deeper, more daring, almost as if the tension around him wasn't slowing him down, but pushing him towards something even greater, and perhaps something darker as well. By the late 1780s, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was living in a strange contradiction. A man creating music that would echo for centuries, while his own life seemed to be quietly slipping out of control. In Vienna, the excitement that once surrounded him had begun to fade. Audiences hadn't turned against him completely, but the novelty was gone. New composers emerged, tastes shifted, and Mozart, as always, refused to simplify himself just to keep up, which is admirable and financially disastrous. Concert opportunities became less frequent. Commissions slowed, The steady flow of income he once relied on turned into something unpredictable, and unpredictability, as Mozart would repeatedly discover, does not mix well with rent. His letters from this period tell the story clearly. He wasn't just struggling, he was asking for help. Money, loans, extensions. The tone shifts from confident to urgent, from hopeful to quietly desperate. It's not the image most people associate with a genius, but it's a very real part of the story. And yet, creatively, he was reaching new heights. Works like The Magic Flute began to take shape, a piece filled with symbolism, mystery, and a strange blend of light and darkness. It wasn't just music anymore. It felt like a reflection of something deeper, something personal. At the same time, Mozart became involved with the Freemasonry, a society that valued enlightenment, reason, and hidden meaning. These ideas began to weave themselves into his compositions, adding layers that went far beyond simple entertainment. But while his mind expanded, his body began to show signs of strain, fatigue, illness, exhaustion. Whether it was the stress, the workload, or something more serious, it was clear that Mozart was no longer operating at the effortless pace of his youth. The energy was still there, but it came at a cost. And then there was the pressure, not just to survive, but to prove, again, that he still mattered. Because being a former prodigy is a dangerous position. People don't remember what you were, they judge what you are now. And Mozart, despite everything he had achieved, was constantly being measured against expectations that were nearly impossible to sustain. Still, he pushed forward, composing, performing when he could, trying to maintain the life he had built, even as it became harder to hold together. And as the world around him grew quieter, more uncertain, one thing became increasingly clear. Mozart was approaching something, not just another composition, not just another success, but something that felt final. By 1791, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was already stretched thin, financially strained, physically exhausted, and yet still composing with a kind of urgency that felt different from before. Faster, deeper, almost as if time itself had started pressing against him. And then a stranger appeared. According to accounts, a mysterious messenger arrived at Mozart's door in Vienna, dressed in grey, carrying a commission unlike any other. He asked Mozart to compose a requiem, a mass for the dead. No explanation, no identity, just a request and payment. It sounds like the beginning of a legend, and in many ways it became one. Mozart accepted, because he needed the money, because he needed the work, and perhaps because something about the request spoke to him on a level he couldn't quite explain. As he began composing what would become Requiem in D minor, something strange began to happen. He became obsessed. This wasn't just another piece, it consumed him. He worked on it between other obligations, late into the night, often while already weakened by illness. And the more he wrote, the more convinced he seemed to become that this wasn't just a commission, it was his own requiem, a piece he was writing for himself. Now, to be clear, history offers a more grounded explanation. The commission likely came from Franz von Walsegg, a count known for anonymously commissioning works and passing them off as his own. The mysterious stranger was probably just a messenger following orders, but Mozart didn't know that, and perception, especially under stress, has a way of reshaping reality. His health continued to decline. Fever, weakness, swelling. Yet he kept composing, dictating sections of the Requiem even when he was too ill to write. It was as if he were racing against something he couldn't see, trying to finish before it caught up. Around him, concern grew. His wife, Constanze Mozart, tried to manage both his condition and their finances. Friends visited, students assisted. But the atmosphere had changed. There was urgency in the room, and something else too, a sense that Mozart himself believed the end was near. Whether that belief came from illness, exhaustion, or the psychological weight of the commission, we can't say for certain. But what we do know is this. The music he was writing during this time carried a depth, a gravity, that felt different from everything before it. Not just brilliant, but final. And as the Requiem slowly took shape, one question lingered. Quiet, unsettling, impossible to ignore. Would he live long enough to finish it? In the final weeks of 1791, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was no longer just a struggling composer. He was a man visibly fading. In Vienna, Winter settled in cold and heavy, and inside his home, the atmosphere had grown tense. Mozart was bedridden, his body weakened by illness that no one could clearly diagnose. Swelling, fever, exhaustion, symptoms that came and went, but never truly left. And yet, the music continued. Even as his strength failed him, Mozart worked on the Requiem in D minor. He dictated sections to his student, Franz Xaver Süssmayr, his voice growing weaker, but his mind still sharp, still precise. He would hum passages, correct mistakes, refine details, as if the piece had to be completed, no matter the cost. At times he reportedly broke down, convinced he was writing the music for his own funeral. Whether this was fear, intuition, or simply the result of exhaustion, it added a haunting layer to everything happening around him. The line between composer and composition seemed to blur. The Requiem wasn't just something he was creating, it was something he was living through. Friends gathered. They tried to comfort him, to keep the mood light, to believe this would pass like previous illnesses. But this time felt different. There was no recovery. On December 5th, 1791, Mozart died at just 35 years old. No grand ceremony, no royal farewell, no dramatic final performance, just silence. He was buried in a common grave, as was typical for the time in Vienna. A detail that would later fuel myths of poverty and neglect. But the truth is less theatrical, and perhaps more unsettling. One of the greatest musical minds in history left the world quietly, without the recognition his legacy would later demand. The Requiem remained unfinished. After his death, Franz Xaver Süssmayr completed the work, guided by Mozart's notes and instructions. It would go on to become one of the most powerful and mysterious compositions ever written, forever tied to the image of a dying composer racing against time. And just like that, the child prodigy who had once amazed kings and emperors was gone, no longer performing, no longer composing, leaving behind a body of work that seemed impossibly vast for such a short life. But perhaps the most haunting part of Mozart's story isn't how he died, it's how much more it feels like he still had left to say. When Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died in 1791, the world did not stop. There was no immediate recognition that something irreplaceable had just been lost. No sense that music itself had shifted. In Vienna, life continued as it always had. Concerts, court events, new composers rising to take the stage. Mozart's passing was noted, but not fully understood. That realization would come later, much later, because Mozart's true legacy didn't explode overnight. It unfolded slowly, almost quietly, as musicians and audiences began to revisit his work. And when they did, something became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just good music. This was something else entirely. Composers like Ludwig van Beethoven studied his pieces, learning from their precision, their balance, their emotional clarity. Mozart had an ability that few others possessed. He could make complexity feel effortless, beauty feel inevitable, and emotion feel honest. His operas, The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, The Magic Flute, began to gain the recognition they hadn't fully received during his lifetime. Audiences started to understand them not just as entertainment, but as layered works filled with psychology, humour, darkness, and insight into human nature. And then there was the Requiem in D minor. Even unfinished, it carried a weight that felt almost otherworldly. The idea that Mozart may have believed he was writing his own funeral music only deepened its mystique. Over time, it became more than a composition. It became a symbol of genius, of mortality, of a life that burned intensely but briefly. The myths grew as well. Stories of rivalry with Antonio Salieri were exaggerated into dramatic tales of jealousy and murder. The image of Mozart as a misunderstood genius, unappreciated in his time, took hold. Some of it was true, much of it was shaped by storytelling, but the core of it remained undeniable. Mozart had changed music. He bridged eras, refined form, and pushed emotional expression further than many thought possible. And he did it all in just 35 years, a timeline that feels almost unreal when compared to the scale of his output. Today, his name is no longer just known. It's permanent, played in concert halls, studied in classrooms, recognised across cultures and generations. And perhaps that is the final, quiet irony of his life. The world that struggled to fully understand him while he was alive eventually built an entire legacy around him after he was gone.